The white ceiling tiles had exactly 347 tiny holes. Hana Kim knew this because she had counted them 12 times since waking up in the medical bay. Her right arm felt wrong, heavy and cold, where flesh should be warm. The cybernetic replacement gleamed under the harsh lights, all metal and wires where her real arm used to be. She tried to wiggle her left leg under the thin hospital blanket. Pain shot up from her knee to her hip. The doctors said she was lucky to keep the leg at all. Lucky. That was what they called surviving when everyone else died. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Colonel Park Jae walked in carrying a thin tablet and wearing the expression of a man about to deliver bad news. His uniform was crisp and clean. Nothing like the torn and bloody clothes Hana remembered from the battlefield 3 weeks ago. "How are you feeling today, Lieutenant Kim?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. Hana turned her head to look at him. "Like I got stepped on by a Vorthak battle mech, sir." Park almost smiled. "Almost. Your sense of humor is intact, that's good. Is it, sir?" Hana lifted her cybernetic arm and watched the fingers open and close. The movement was smooth but felt like watching someone else's hand. "Because the rest of me seems pretty broken." Park set the tablet on his lap and leaned forward. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that what happened at Harmony Station was not your fault. You followed orders. You did your duty." Hana closed her eyes. She could still see it all. The Vorthak ships dropping from the sky like metal rain. The evacuation sirens that came too late. Her squad running toward the transport ships with civilians, trying to buy time for people to escape. The explosion that took out half her team, in one bright flash. "Duty," she repeated. "Right. The medical board has completed their review." Park picked up the tablet again. "Your injuries are extensive. The cybernetic arm will function, but it will never be as good as what you had. Your leg will heal, but you'll always have a limp. The board has decided that you are no longer fit for active combat duty." Hana opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling again. 347 holes. She had counted them right the first time. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Honorable discharge. Full benefits. You've served the Terran Defense Force with distinction for 8 years. You've earned your rest." Rest. The word felt empty. What was she supposed to do with rest when the war was still happening? When the Vorthak were still out there, still killing people? "I understand this is difficult," Park continued. "But there are other ways to serve. Training positions, administrative roles. You could help new recruits learn what you've learned." "What I've learned," Hana said slowly, "is how to watch good people die." Park was quiet for a moment. Through the window, Hana could see the busy streets of New Busan Colony. People walked back and forth, going about their lives. They looked normal, but she knew better. Everyone here was just one Vorthak attack away from being refugees. Or corpses. "There's something else," Park said. "The survivors from Harmony Station are being housed in temporary shelters near the spaceport. The children especially are having a hard time. Some of them saw things no child should see." Hana turned her head toward him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because they ask about you. The ones who remember being evacuated. They remember the soldier with the broken arm who kept fighting even after she was hurt. They ask if you're okay." Something twisted in Hana's chest. She remembered some of those faces. Small faces streaked with dirt and tears looking up at her as she helped them into the transport ships. She had been bleeding from a dozen wounds, her right arm hanging useless at her side, but she had kept loading people onto those ships until the world exploded around her. "They shouldn't remember me," she said quietly. "But they do." Park stood up. "I'll leave the discharge papers here. Take your time to think about it. But Hana, don't think your fighting days are over just because the medical board says so. Sometimes, the most important battles aren't fought with guns." After he left, Hana lay in the silence and tried not to think about anything, but the thoughts came anyway. She thought about Jin Woo, her squad leader, who had died trying to hold the Vorthak back from the civilian shelters. She thought about Mira, the medic who had patched up Hana's arm with field bandages and a prayer before a plasma blast vaporized her. She thought about all the people they had saved and all the people they couldn't save. The next morning, a nurse helped her into a wheelchair and took her to the physical therapy room. Hana's new arm moved when she told it to, but it felt like wearing a glove that didn't fit right. Her leg buckled when she tried to put weight on it. It takes time, the therapist said. Your body needs to learn how to work with the prosthetic. Don't push too hard. But Hana had never been good at not pushing too hard. By the end of the week, she could walk short distances with a cane. The cybernetic arm was getting easier to control, though it still felt foreign. On her 8th day in the hospital, she heard children's voices in the hallway. She looked out her door and saw a group of young refugees being led on a tour of the medical facility. The guide was explaining how the hospital helped people get better. One of the children, a girl who couldn't have been older than 8, lagged behind the group. She had short black hair and wore clothes that were too big for her. There was something about the way she held herself, like she was trying to become invisible. The girl looked into Hana's room and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the girl raised her hand in a small wave. Hana lifted her cybernetic hand and waved back. The metal fingers moved smoothly, and for the first time since the surgery, the prosthetic didn't feel completely wrong. The guide called for the children to keep up and the group moved on, but the girl looked back once more before disappearing around the corner. That night, Hana couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that small wave, about the trust in a child's eyes. She thought about what Colonel Park had said about fighting, battles that weren't fought with guns. When morning came, she made a decision. She wouldn't sign the discharge papers yet. There were still people who needed protecting, and maybe being broken didn't mean being useless. Maybe it just meant she had to find a different way to fight. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Hana Kim stood in the middle of an empty warehouse on the edge of New Busan Colony. Her cybernetic arm whirred softly as she lifted a training rifle. Her left leg still ached, but she had learned to work with the pain instead of fighting it. "Are you sure about this?" asked Dong-woo, the mechanic who owned the warehouse. He was a thin man in his 40s with grease permanently stained under his fingernails. A shuttle accident 2 years ago had damaged his spine, leaving him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. "No," Hana said honestly, "but we're doing it anyway." The warehouse door opened and more people filed in. There was Mi Young, a school teacher who had lost most of her hearing in a Vorthok bombing. She communicated through hand signs and reading lips. Behind her came a dozen others: shop owners, mechanics, farmers, office workers. All of them were too old, too young, too injured, or too inexperienced for the military. All of them had volunteered to learn how to fight. Hana had started small. After visiting the refugee camps and seeing how scared and helpless people felt, she had put up a simple notice on the colony's public bulletin board. Basic defense training, free, no experience required. She hadn't expected anyone to show. 57 people came to the first meeting. "Listen up," Hana said, her voice carrying across the warehouse. "The military taught me how to fight wars, but wars are fought by soldiers against soldiers. What I want to teach you is something different. I want to teach you how to protect people." She walked slowly in front of the group, her cane tapping against the concrete floor. "The Vorthak are coming. We all know it. The question is what we do when they get here." An older woman raised her hand. "The evacuation plans say we should go to the shelters and wait for rescue." "The evacuation plans are garbage," Hana said bluntly. "I've seen what happens when people wait for rescue. Sometimes, rescue doesn't come." She stopped walking and faced the group. Show of hands. How many of you have family members who are not able to run fast or fight back? Children, elderly parents, disabled relatives? Almost every hand went up. Right. So when the attack comes, you're not just protecting yourselves. You're protecting people who can't protect themselves. That changes everything. Over the next 2 hours, Hana taught them basics that the military manual would have said were wrong. Instead of teaching them to attack, she taught them how to hide people quickly and quietly. Instead of showing them how to hold ground, she showed them how to buy time for others to escape. Your cybernetic arm, said a young man named Hyunsu. Does it give you an advantage? Hana flexed the metal fingers. It's stronger than a real arm and it doesn't get tired, but it's also heavier and slower to react. She demonstrated by picking up a heavy crate that would have taken 2 people to lift. The trick is not pretending it's the same as what I lost. The trick is figuring out what it can do that my old arm couldn't. She looked around the group. Same thing applies to all of you. Dongwoo, your back injury means you can't run fast, but you know every maintenance tunnel and service corridor in this colony better than anyone. Ma Young, you can't hear verbal orders in a firefight, but you can see things the rest of us miss and you can communicate silently. The training sessions became a regular thing. 3 times a week the group met in the warehouse. Hana taught them how to move injured people quickly, how to set up hidden supply caches, how to use everyday tools as weapons if necessary. More importantly, she taught them how to think like protectors instead of victims. The group grew. Word spread quietly through the colony. People who had never thought of themselves as fighters started showing up. A grandmother who had survived 3 different wars. A teenager who walked with crutches but had perfect aim with a slingshot. A former pilot who had lost both hands in an accident but could still plan escape routes better than anyone. Then the news came. The Vorthak had broken through the outer defense line. 3 colonies in the Centauri sector had gone dark in the past week. Refugee ships were arriving daily at New Busan, carrying stories of cities burning and families torn apart. Hana called an emergency meeting of her training group. When she walked into the warehouse, she found twice as many people as usual waiting for her. You've all heard the news, she said without preamble. The Vorthak are maybe 2 weeks out from the sector. The military is pulling back to more defensible positions. What does that mean for us? Asked Mi Young, her words slightly slurred, but clear. Hana had been dreading this question. It means we're on our own. The warehouse fell silent. She could see fear in their faces, but also something else. Determination. I've been thinking about this, Hana continued. The military's job is to fight the Vorthak military. Our job is different. Our job is to make sure that when the fighting is over, there are still people left to protect. She walked to a map of the colony that Dongwoo had hung on the wall. Red pins marked the locations of schools, hospitals, elderly care centers, and refugee camps. We're going to create something new, she said. Not a fighting force, a protection network. When the attack comes, our job isn't to stop the Vorthak ships. Our job is to make sure every person in those buildings gets out alive. Over the next week, they worked frantically. Dongwoo mapped out escape routes through the maintenance tunnels. Mi Young organized silent communication systems. The grandmother, whose name was Sunja, taught them how to move large groups of people without panic. Hana felt something she hadn't experienced since before Harmony Station. Purpose. The training group had become something more than she had planned. They weren't just learning to fight back. They were learning to fight for something bigger than themselves. When the first Vorthak scout ships appeared on the colony's sensors, Hana gathered her people one last time. This is it, she said. Remember, we're not trying to win a war. We're trying to save lives. Every person we get to safety is a victory. They scattered to their positions throughout the colony. Hana remained in the warehouse, coordinating through comm channels that the military didn't monitor. Her cybernetic arm was steady as she tracked the approaching ships on her scanner. The real test was about to begin. The attack on New Busan came at dawn, just like Hana knew it would. The Vorthak always attacked at dawn. Through her warehouse window, she watched their ships descend through the orange sky like dark birds of prey. Her comm device buzzed with quick, coded messages from her network. School clear. Hospital empty. Tunnels secure. The protection network was working exactly as they had planned, but something unexpected happened. When the Vorthak landed and began their sweep of the colony, they found mostly empty buildings. The evacuation had been too fast and too complete. There was no one left to capture, no civilians to use as shields or bargaining chips. They're confused, reported Hyun-soo from his position near the spaceport. The Vorthak ground forces are just standing around. They expected resistance and refugees, but there's nothing here. Hana smiled grimly. Good. Let them be confused. The successful evacuation of New Busan changed everything. Within days, Hana received messages from other colonies asking for help. People had heard about the mysterious protection network that could make entire populations disappear before an attack. She found herself sitting across from Jin Ho, a former military engineer who had been discharged for questioning orders. He was tall and serious, with careful eyes that seemed to evaluate everything twice before trusting it. You realize what you're proposing is completely against military doctrine, he said, studying the plans Hana had spread across the table in her new headquarters, another abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Military doctrine got my squad killed and left thousands of civilians to die, Hana replied. I'm not interested in military doctrine anymore. Jin-ho nodded slowly. Good. Because what you're asking for is impossible according to military doctrine. You want to create a network of hidden bases across 12 colonies, all connected by secure communications, all dedicated to civilian protection instead of strategic value. That's right. It would require ships, supplies, weapons, medical equipment, and about 200 people willing to risk court-martial or worse. Hana leaned back in her chair. Her cybernetic arm rested on the table, fingers drumming silently against the metal surface. Is that a no? Jin-ho grinned suddenly. That's a hell yes. When do we start? The sanctuary protocol, as they came to call it, grew faster than Hana had dared to hope. Dr. So Young joined them after being court-martialed for treating wounded Vorthak soldiers. She was a small woman with steady hands and an absolute refusal to let anyone suffer if she could prevent it. The medical board said I violated the rules of engagement, she explained to Hana during their first meeting. I said injured people are injured people, regardless of which side they're fighting for. And now? Hana asked. Now I'd rather help people than follow rules that get people killed. Within 3 months, they had established 7 hidden bases across the Outer Rim colonies. Each base was designed not for fighting, but for hiding. Underground shelters that could house hundreds of people. Medical facilities run by doctors who had been dismissed from military service for caring too much. Supply networks that moved food, medicine, and hope to places the official military had written off as lost causes. The Vorthak advanced through the outer colonies like a slow-moving storm. But something strange began happening. Their casualty reports showed massive military victories, but the civilian death tolls were impossibly low. Entire planets seemed to empty out before the attacks came. Hana stood in the command center of Sanctuary Base 1, watching reports flow in from across the frontier. The base was built into an asteroid mining facility that had been abandoned for 5 years. Perfect camouflage for a place that wasn't supposed to exist. Kepler Colony is requesting immediate evacuation assistance, reported Mi Young, her hands flying across a silent keyboard as she coordinated communications. They have about 6,000 civilians and maybe 12 hours before the Vorthak arrive. What's our capacity? Hana asked Jin-ho. We can get 4,000 out through the primary routes, he said, checking his tablet. The other 2,000 will have to use the secondary shelters. What about transport? 3 refugee ships standing by, plus the usual collection of freighters and mining vessels. Hana nodded. It wasn't enough, but it was what they had. Send the evacuation signal. Across the galaxy, a network of ordinary people sprang into action. Teachers became evacuation coordinators. Mechanics turned their workshops into emergency supply stations. Retired pilots flew ships into dangerous territory to pick up people that the military couldn't or wouldn't save. The little girl from the hospital, Su Jin, had become a regular presence at the base. She was 9 years old now and spoke 4 languages fluently. The trauma of losing her parents had left her with an unusual gift for understanding people who didn't share a common language. The Vorthak families want to know if they can trust us, she translated during a meeting with a group of defectors who had contacted the sanctuary through back channels. Hana looked at the alien beings sitting nervously around the conference table. They were smaller than she had expected, with gray skin and large eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Tell them that anyone who wants to protect innocent people instead of killing them is welcome here, Hana said. Sujin spoke rapidly in the clicking, whistling language of the Vorthok. One of the aliens responded, and Sujin listened carefully before turning back to Hana. They say their government tells them that humans never show mercy to prisoners. They want to know why you're different. Hana thought about that for a moment. Tell them that being broken taught me something that being whole never could. Tell them that sometimes the people who have lost the most are the ones who understand best what's worth protecting. The conversation continued for hours. By the end of it, 3 Vorthak families had agreed to help with evacuations in exchange for sanctuary. It was a small start, but it was something neither the human military nor the Vorthak Empire had thought possible. As the months passed, the sanctuary protocol evolved into something larger than a protection network. It became a way of thinking about conflict that neither side had considered. Instead of fighting over territory, they were creating spaces where fighting wasn't necessary. The war continued to rage across the galaxy, but in the shadows between the battles, ordinary people were building something extraordinary. They were proving that the most powerful weapon against war wasn't a bigger gun or a stronger army. It was the simple act of refusing to let innocent people become casualties. Hana sat in her command chair, watching status reports from 17 different bases. Her cybernetic arm moved smoothly as she coordinated evacuations, supply runs, and refugee placements. Her damaged leg still ached, but she had learned to think of the pain as a reminder rather than a limitation. A reminder that being broken didn't mean being finished. Sometimes it just meant you were ready to build something completely new. The message came through encrypted channels at 0300 hours. Colonel Park Jae's face appeared on Hana's screen, looking older and more tired than she remembered. "Lieutenant Kim," he said, and his use of her old rank made her stomach tighten. "We need to talk." Hana was alone in the command center of Sanctuary Base 1. Around her, screens showed the status of 19 bases scattered across 8 star systems. In the past 6 months, the Sanctuary Protocol had evacuated over 200,000 civilians from war zones. They had also apparently gotten the attention of Terran Command. "I'm listening, sir," she said. "Cut the military courtesy, Hana. You know why I'm calling?" Park's voice was flat and official. "Terran intelligence has been tracking unauthorized military equipment, personnel, and communications. The trail leads directly to you." "People needed help," Hana said simply. "People always need help. That doesn't give you the right to steal military supplies and recruit deserters to your personal crusade." "Is that what you think this is? A personal crusade?" Park was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Hana could see the sterile walls of a military command center. Everything clean and regulation and cold. "I think you're a good soldier who got broken by the war and can't accept that some battles can't be won," he said finally. "You're right," Hana admitted. "I am broken. But maybe that's exactly what this situation needed." Park leaned forward on his screen. "Hana, I have orders to bring you in. Charges include desertion, theft of military property, unauthorized recruitment and operation of an illegal paramilitary organization. And if I refuse to come quietly, then I come with a full company of Marines and arrest everyone in your network as enemy collaborators." The connection ended. Hana sat in the dark command center for a long time, thinking. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the lights of the refugee quarters where families slept safely. Children who would have died in the bombing of their home worlds. Elderly people who would have been left behind in the evacuation of military bases. Wounded soldiers from both sides who had chosen healing over hatred. Her comm system chimed. Jinho's voice came through the speakers. "We intercepted the transmission," he said. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 12 hours before Park arrives with his arrest warrant." "Orders?" Hana looked around the command center one more time. At the maps showing sanctuary routes, at the photos of successful evacuations, at the list of bases that had become homes for people who had nowhere else to go. "Prepare the emergency broadcast," she said. Jinho was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll call us traitors." "They already do. The emergency broadcast took 3 hours to prepare. Dr. So Young helped gather the medical evidence. Mi Young coordinated with the other bases to collect testimonials. Su Jin, now 11 and serving as official translator for the sanctuary, helped compile statements from Vorthak defectors. When everything was ready, Hana stood in front of a simple camera in a small room. She wore no uniform and carried no weapons. She looked like what she was, a disabled veteran with a cybernetic arm and a walking cane. "My name is Hana Kim," she began. "6 months ago, I was discharged from the Terran Defense Force as unfit for duty. Today I want to tell you about the war that both sides don't want you to know about." The broadcast went out on every frequency they could access: military channels, civilian networks, emergency beacons, even hijacked entertainment broadcasts. For 2 hours, Hana told the galaxy about the sanctuary protocol. She showed footage of successful evacuations. She played recordings of Terran commanders discussing acceptable civilian casualty rates. She presented evidence of Vorthak military units deliberately targeting refugee ships. She let Vorthak defectors explain in their own words why they had chosen to help human civilians instead of fighting human soldiers. "The question isn't whether humans or Vorthak are better," she said near the end. "The question is whether we're going to protect innocent people or use them as weapons. Because right now both sides are treating civilians as acceptable losses in a war that could end tomorrow, if we decided it was more important to save lives than to win battles." When the broadcast ended, Hana sat back in her chair and waited. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, civilian populations on dozens of worlds were demanding protection from their own governments. Vorthak separatist groups declared their intention to join the sanctuary protocol. Military personnel from both sides began deserting their posts to join what news organizations were calling the Broken Army. But the response from official sources was just as swift. Terran Command declared Hana Kim a terrorist and enemy of humanity. The Vorthak Empire put a massive bounty on her head. Both sides mobilized forces to hunt down and destroy the sanctuary bases. Colonel Park arrived at Sanctuary Base 1 with 2 companies of Marines and a warrant for Hana's arrest. What he found when he breached the main entrance was not what he expected. The base was not empty, but it was not defended either. Hundreds of people sat quietly in the main hangar bay. Refugees, volunteers, former soldiers, and Vorthak civilians all sitting together peacefully. At the front of the group sat Hana Kim, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. "Lieutenant Kim," Park said formally, "you are under arrest for crimes against the Terran Defense Force and humanity." Hana stood slowly, using her cane for support. "I understand, sir." But before Park could take her into custody, something unexpected happened. A small figure stepped forward from the crowd. Su Jin, barely tall enough to reach Hana's shoulder, positioned herself between the Marines and the woman who had saved her life. "She is not a criminal," the girl said in clear, careful English. "She is a guardian." One by one, others stood up. Jin Ho, limping slightly but standing straight. Dr. So Young, her medical bag still slung over her shoulder. Mi Young, her hands moving in quick signs that needed no translation. Dongwu, leaning on his cane but refusing to sit down. Soon, the entire hangar was standing. Human refugees and Vorthak families, former soldiers and civilian volunteers, children and elderly people, all of them looking at Park and his Marines with quiet determination. "These people are not criminals either," Su Jin continued. "They are people who chose to save lives instead of taking them." Park looked around the hangar at the faces surrounding him. He had come expecting to arrest a rogue soldier and her accomplices. Instead, he found himself facing something he had never encountered before, a community that had chosen to define victory differently than anyone else in the galaxy. "Stand aside," he ordered the girl. "This woman is coming with me." Su Jin shook her head. "Then you will have to arrest all of us." Park raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking. Around the hangar, his Marines looked uncertain. They had signed up to fight enemy soldiers, not to arrest children and medical volunteers. "Sir," one of the Marines said quietly, "what exactly are our orders here?" Park stared at Hana Kim, the broken soldier who had somehow built something, that neither the Terran military nor the Vorthak Empire had been able to destroy. Something that had saved more lives in 6 months than most military campaigns saved in years. Our orders, he said, finally lowering his weapon, are to figure out what the hell happens next. The trial of Hana Kim took place not in a military court, but in the chambers of the Galactic Council, on the neutral station of Harmony Point. It was the first time in galactic history that both the Terran Defense Force and the Vorthak Empire had agreed to submit to outside judgment. Hana sat at a simple table in the center of the vast chamber, wearing plain civilian clothes. Her cybernetic arm rested calmly on the table surface. Her walking cane leaned against her chair. She looked small and ordinary, surrounded by the formal grandeur of galactic politics. The charges read against her were serious: desertion, theft of military property, operating an illegal organization, interfering with military operations, harboring enemy combatants. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Advocate Chen, spoke for 3 hours about the dangers of allowing individual soldiers to decide which orders to follow. The defendant may claim noble intentions, Chen said, but the precedent she sets is catastrophic. If every soldier can simply decide that their personal moral code overrides military command, we have no military structure at all. We have chaos. When it was time for Hana's defense, she stood and walked slowly to the center of the chamber. She had refused legal representation, insisting on speaking for herself. "The prosecutor is right," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "I did desert my post. I did steal military supplies. I did build an organization that interfered with both armies." Murmurs ran through the gallery. This was not the defense anyone had expected. "But I want to ask a different question," Hana continued. "What is the military for?" She turned slowly, her gaze taking in the assembled representatives from dozens of worlds. "The Terran Defense Force told me the military exists to protect human interests. The Vorthak Empire says their forces exist to protect Vorthak interests. But whose interests were being protected when cities full of civilians became acceptable casualties? Whose interests were served when refugee ships became military targets?" She walked closer to the gallery where hundreds of observers sat watching. 6 months ago, I was considered too broken to serve. My cybernetic arm made me slower. My damaged leg made me weaker. I was medically discharged because I couldn't meet the physical standards required for a soldier. Hana held up her cybernetic hand, letting the light catch the metal surfaces. But it turns out that being broken taught me something that being whole never could. It taught me that strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose to protect. The chamber was completely silent now. The sanctuary protocol saved over 300,000 civilian lives in 6 months. We evacuated children from bombing zones. We provided medical care to wounded from both sides. We created safe spaces where Vorthak and human families could live together peacefully. She paused, looking directly at the panel of judges. And we did it all with stolen supplies, deserter soldiers, and an organization that was illegal, according to both governments. Which makes me wonder, if saving innocent lives is illegal, what does that say about the laws? When Hana finished speaking, the chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then a small figure stood up in the gallery. Su Jin, now 12 years old and serving as the official voice of the sanctuary refugees, walked to the witness stand. "May I speak?" she asked in perfectly clear Standard Galactic. The lead judge, a tall alien with blue skin and 4 arms, nodded. "My name is Su Jin Park. When I was 8 years old, I watched my parents die in the bombing of Harmony Station. I stopped speaking for 3 months because I thought words were useless when people could disappear so quickly." Her voice was steady and clear, with no trace of the frightened child she had once been. "Hana Kim found me in a refugee camp. She didn't try to make me talk. She didn't promise me that everything would be okay. She just showed me that some people choose to build instead of destroy, even when they're broken themselves." Su Jin looked around the chamber at the representatives, judges, and observers. "The question in this trial isn't whether Hana Kim broke military law. She did. The question is whether saving lives is more important than following orders. And if you decide that following orders is more important than saving lives, then you're choosing to live in a galaxy where children like me don't matter. Over the next 3 days, dozens of witnesses testified. Jinho explained how the sanctuary's engineering innovations had revolutionized refugee transport. Dr. So Young presented medical data showing that their treatment centers had higher survival rates than official military hospitals. Ma Young demonstrated the communication systems that allowed evacuation of entire populations in hours instead of days. But the most powerful testimony came from the refugees themselves. Families who had been saved from bombing runs. Elderly people who had been abandoned by military evacuations. Children who had grown up in sanctuary bases learning that former enemies could become friends. On the final day, Advocate Chen made her closing argument. The defendants' actions, whatever their outcome, represent a fundamental breakdown of military discipline and government authority. If we excuse these crimes because we approve of their results, we open the door to every future soldier who decides they know better than their commanders. Then Hana stood for her final statement. The prosecutor keeps talking about military discipline and government authority, she said. But I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the little girl who waved at me from a hospital corridor. She looked up at the gallery where Su Jin sat with other sanctuary refugees. When I was lying in that hospital bed, I thought my life was over. I thought being broken meant being useless. But that little girl taught me something. She taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is wave back. Hana turned to face the judges directly. I'm not asking you to excuse what I did. I'm asking you to understand why I did it. There are children in this galaxy who need someone to wave back when they reach out. There are families who need someone to choose their lives over military strategy. There are people on both sides of this war who are tired of being told that their deaths are acceptable losses. She paused, her cybernetic hand gripping her cane. The sanctuary protocol proved something that both governments said was impossible. It proved that people don't have to be enemies just because their leaders are at war. It proved that protecting innocent lives is more powerful than any weapon either side has built. The judges deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the lead judge stood to deliver the verdict. The defendant is guilty of all charges as specified under current military law, she announced. Hana closed her eyes and waited for the sentence. However, the judge continued, this court finds that current military law is inadequate to address the humanitarian crisis created by this conflict. The defendant's actions, while technically illegal, represent a higher moral authority that this court cannot ignore. The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. Therefore, this court sentences Hana Kim to immediate release and formal recognition as the first Director of Galactic Civilian Protection, a new organization that will be jointly funded by all member worlds of this council. The judge looked directly at Hana. Furthermore, the Sanctuary Protocol is hereby recognized as the foundation model for civilian protection in all future conflicts. Military commanders from all species will be required to undergo training in civilian protection protocols developed by Director Kim and her team. When the session ended, Hana found herself surrounded by reporters, officials, and refugees. But the first person to reach her was Su Jin, who pushed through the crowd and wrapped her arms around the woman who had taught her that broken people could still build beautiful things. So what happens now? Asked Jin Ho as they stood together outside the council chambers. Hana looked out at the stars visible through the station's massive windows. Somewhere out there conflicts were still raging. But now there was something else spreading through the galaxy. The idea that protecting innocent people was not just possible but necessary. Now, she said, adjusting her grip on her walking, Kane, we get back to work. There are still people out there who need someone to wave back. 6 months later, the war between the Terran Defense Force and the Vorthak Empire officially ended, not with a decisive military victory, but with a joint declaration that civilian protection took priority over territorial conquest. The peace treaty was signed in a ceremony at Sanctuary Base 1, with Hana Kim serving as the neutral mediator. When asked by reporters how she had managed to end a war that military leaders said was unwinnable, she gave a simple answer. I didn't end the war, she said. I just figured out how to make it irrelevant. And in refugee camps across the galaxy, children who had been saved by the Sanctuary Protocol were learning that the strongest thing you could be was not a perfect soldier, but a person who chose to protect others even when you were broken yourself. Especially when you were broken yourself.